In a village called Modin, about 17 miles northwest of Jerusalem, a royal officer set up a portable altar in the middle of the square. The year was 167 before Christ. The officer had a list. He had authority from the Seleucid king, and he had a simple instruction to deliver to the villagers standing in front of him. Come forward, offer a sacrifice on this altar, eat what is placed on it, and you will be counted among the king's friends. An old priest named Mattathias was standing in that square with his 5 sons. The officer addressed him directly, because that is how these things were done. Take the lead. You are a man of standing here. If you go first, the rest will follow, and there will be no unpleasantness. Mattathias said no, loudly, in front of everybody. And then another man from the village stepped out of the crowd and walked toward the altar to comply. What happened next is recorded in 1 Maccabees 2:24. Mattathias, the account says, was consumed with zeal. He ran forward and killed the man at the altar. Then he killed the king's officer standing beside it. Then he tore the altar down with his hands, and he shouted a line into that village square that would echo for the next 200 years. Everyone who is zealous for the law, follow me. He and his sons ran for the hills that afternoon. Nothing about that scene appears in a Protestant Bible. Turn the last page of Malachi, and the very next page begins the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And between those 2 pages, there is nothing but a sheet of paper and a heading. Yet the war that started in that village square is the reason the Judaism of the Gospels exists in the form it does. Almost every institution Jesus walks into, argues with, teaches in, and is eventually killed by was built during the period you were taught to call empty. So let me say the thing this whole conversation turns on, and I want you to hold it, because I am going to say it again at the end in exactly these words. God stopped speaking and started building. Those years were not an absence, they were a construction site. Now let me show you what got built. First, the phrase itself, because it has 3 words in it and 2 of them are wrong. The 400 silent years. It is not 400, and it was not silent. Malachi is usually dated somewhere around 430 before Christ, though the date is not certain and scholars argue about it. John the Baptist begins preaching somewhere in the mid-20s after Christ. That is closer to 450 years. And it depends entirely on where you decide to put your pins. The bigger problem is the word silent. The Jewish world of those centuries was not quiet. It was one of the most productive stretches of religious writing in the history of the Jewish people. 1st and 2nd Maccabees. The book of Sirach, written by a Jerusalem scribe named Ben Sira around 180 before Christ, and unusual because he is the only writer of the period who signs his own name to his work. Jubilees, Enoch, the Wisdom of Solomon, the entire library at Qumran that we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls. Something was being written on nearly every one of those supposedly empty years. So where does the silence idea come from? It comes from the period itself, and this is the part that gets left out of the debate. The Jews of those centuries believed it too. 1 Maccabees 9:27 says there was distress in Israel such as had not been since the time that prophets stopped appearing among them. 1 Maccabees 4:46 describes the men who cleansed the desecrated temple, storing the defiled altar stones in a corner of the Temple Mount, because they did not know what to do with them, and they were waiting until a prophet should come to tell them. Read that again slowly. They tore down the polluted altar. They did not know the correct disposal ritual. There was no one to ask. Josephus, writing near the end of the 1st century after Christ, says something similar in Against Apion 1.41. He says the history of his people has been written carefully since the reign of Artaxerxes, but that it has not been held in the same authority as the older books, because there had not been an exact succession of prophets since that time. So the silence is real. This is a felt silence, described from the inside by people who were living in it and did not like it. Here is where I want to take a position. The phrase is not wrong so much as it is lazy, and the laziness has cost the church something, because what 400 silent years communicates to the average person in the pew is, nothing happened, skip it, resume at Matthew, and that instruction is catastrophic for reading the Gospels. You cannot understand the argument in Mark 12 about knowing when Jews started arguing about resurrection. Nor can you understand why a synagogue exists in Capernaum when no synagogue exists anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. And the crowd on Palm Sunday makes no sense at all, neither what it shouts, nor why that shout is a death sentence, until you know what the word Messiah had come to mean and who had made it mean that. Skipping the gap does not save you time. It costs you the Gospels, so we go back to the beginning of it, which is a lot quieter than the end. When Malachi puts down his pen, the Jewish homeland is a small, poor, unimpressive administrative district of the Persian Empire. The Persians called it Yehud. It was perhaps 25 miles across at its widest. Jerusalem had a rebuilt temple that the older generation had wept over, because it was so obviously inferior to the one Solomon built. There was no king. There had not been a king since the exile. The high priest was the closest thing the nation had to a head of state, which is a detail worth filing away, because in about 300 years it will explode. The most consequential figure of this early stretch is Ezra, and the word attached to his name is the first Hebrew word I want to put in front of you. Ezra is called a sofer. We translate it scribe. In the older monarchy, a sofer was a bureaucrat, a recorder, a man who kept accounts and drafted royal correspondence. The word has no religious weight to it at all. By the time it attaches to Ezra, it has changed completely. A sofer is now a man who copies, guards, interprets, and teaches the sacred text. He does not receive the word, he handles it. That shift is the smallest and most important thing that happens in this whole story. Because a prophet is a mouth. A prophet stands in front of you and says, "Thus says the Lord," and the authority is immediate, personal, and unrepeatable. A scribe is a pair of hands. A scribe says, "Here is what was said, and here is what it means, and here is how you obey it." One is a live broadcast. The other is an archive. When the voice stops, the archive is all you have, and a people who had been listening for 800 years had to become a people who could read. This is the first thing built in the silence, and it took about a century to build, and it happened so quietly that nobody wrote it down. Then, in 332 before Christ, a 23-year-old Macedonian walked through the region on his way to Egypt and changed everything without particularly meaning to. Alexander did not persecute the Jews. He barely noticed them. He died in 323 before Christ at 32 years old, and his generals carved up the empire between them, and the Jewish homeland ended up under the Ptolemies of Egypt for the better part of a century. Ptolemaic rule was, by ancient standards, mild. Taxes were paid. The temple ran. Nobody was slaughtered for keeping the Sabbath. And that is precisely what made it dangerous. Here is what I think most treatments of this period get wrong. They frame Hellenism as an attack. It was not an attack. It was an offer. Greek culture arrived with a gymnasium, a theatre, a philosophy, a literature, an athletic ideal, a common language, and a global professional class you could join if you were willing to sand off the parts of yourself that did not fit. It did not tell you to stop being Jewish. It told you, gently and constantly, that being Jewish was provincial. Persecution creates martyrs. Prestige creates converts. By the 2nd century before Christ, 1 Maccabees 1:15 records that some Jewish men in Jerusalem were undergoing a surgical procedure to disguise the fact that they had been circumcised, so that they could compete naked in the gymnasium without embarrassment. That is not a persecuted community. That is an ambitious one. Somewhere in the middle of the 3rd century before Christ, in Alexandria, the most consequential act of translation in human history took place. The Hebrew scriptures began to be rendered into Greek. The result is what we call the Septuagint. A document called the Letter of Aristeas tells the story. 72 Jewish scholars sent from Jerusalem at the request of King Ptolemy II, working for 72 days, producing a translation of the Law of Moses for the Great Library. The letter is almost certainly a piece of later promotional literature rather than a historical account, and I want to be honest about that. Most scholars treat it as legend, but the core of it holds. The Torah was translated into Greek in Egypt in the 3rd century before Christ, and the prophets and the writings followed over the next century or so. 2 details from that translation reach directly into your Bible. The first is a word. The Hebrew Mashiach means anointed one. The translators needed a Greek equivalent, and they chose Christos, which is built from a verb meaning to smear or to rub with oil. Sit with that. The word Christ was coined by Jewish translators in Egypt, roughly 2 centuries before there was a Christian alive to use it. When the church later says Jesus is the Christ, it is reaching for a word that a Greek-speaking Jewish scholar in Alexandria selected while working through a scroll. The second detail is more contested, and I will flag the dispute rather than pretend it away. In Isaiah 7 verse 14, the Hebrew word is alma. It means a young woman of marriageable age. Hebrew has a more precise word for virgin, and Isaiah did not use it. The Septuagint translators rendered alma as parthenos, which in Greek carries a much stronger sense of virginity. Matthew 1 verse 23 quotes the Greek. Now the debate here is genuine, and it runs in both directions. Some argue the translators simply assumed a young unmarried woman was a virgin, which in that culture was a reasonable default. Others note that the Septuagint uses parthenos loosely elsewhere. Still others argue the translators understood the verse messianically and chose deliberately. I do not think the evidence settles it. What is not in dispute is the mechanism. A theological line that runs straight through the Christmas story passes through a translation decision made by Jewish scholars in Egypt during the years we call silent. Then the tone changes. Around 200 before Christ, the Seleucid Empire took the region from the Ptolemies. And in 175 before Christ, a man came to the Seleucid throne who gave himself a title. Antiochus IV called himself Epiphanes, God manifest, God made visible. His subjects behind his back called him Epimanes, the madman. What Antiochus discovered on arrival was that the Jewish high priesthood, the most sacred office in the nation, was purchasable. 2 Maccabees 4 tells the story with a kind of disgusted precision. A man named Jason bought the office out from under his own brother by promising the king more money. A few years later, a man named Menelaus outbid Jason and took it from him. The holiest chair in Judaism became an auction lot. I want to pause here, because this is the detail that explains everything that follows. The corruption did not come from outside, it was internal. Jerusalem's own elite sold the office because the office had become political rather than prophetic, and it had become political because there was no prophetic voice left to tell them not to. The silence had consequences. This was one of them. In 167 before Christ, Antiochus did something no previous foreign ruler had attempted. He banned the religion. Sabbath observance outlawed. Circumcision outlawed on penalty of death for the mother and the child. Scrolls of the law burned. Sacrifice in the temple halted. And on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, an altar to a Greek god was installed on top of the altar of burnt offering in the temple in Jerusalem, and unclean animals were sacrificed on it. 2 Maccabees 6-2 says the temple itself was formally renamed for Olympian Zeus. The book of Daniel has a phrase for this. In Hebrew, shikutz shomem, usually translated the abomination of desolation, and there is a scholarly proposal about that phrase which, if it is right, is one of the sharpest pieces of writing in the Hebrew Bible. The Aramaic title of the god in question was Baal Shamem, Lord of Heaven. The proposal, which goes back to 19th century scholarship and is widely though not universally held, is that Shikutz Shomem is a deliberate mangling of Baal Shamem. The author swaps the word for Lord with the word for detestable thing, and twists the word for heaven into the word for desolation. Lord of Heaven becomes abomination of desolation. It is a pun. It is a savage, deadly serious pun, written by someone who could not say what he thought out loud, so he said it in the shape of the name itself. Such was the world Mattathias was standing in when the officer arrived in Modane. The revolt that followed was led, after Mattathias died in 166 before Christ, by his third son Judas, and Judas carried a nickname that most likely comes from the Aramaic word makaba, hammer. Judas the hammer fought the way a smaller force always has to fight. Night raids, broken supply lines, mountain passes, never a set-piece battle if he could avoid one. And in 164 before Christ, 3 years to the day after the desecration, on the 25th of Kislev, the Maccabees stood in a temple they had scrubbed clean, with a new altar built of unhewn stones, and rededicated it. The Hebrew word for dedication is Hanukkah. Now turn to John 10, verse 22. It was winter, John writes, and the feast of dedication was taking place in Jerusalem. And Jesus was walking in the temple courts in Solomon's colonnade, and the crowd gathered around him and asked how long he was going to keep them in suspense, and told him to say plainly whether he was the Messiah. That festival exists because of the war that started in Modane. The building he is standing in is standing because a priest's son, with a hammer for a nickname, took it back by force, and the question the crowd asks him at that particular festival, in that particular building, is not a coincidence. They are asking the Hanukkah question: are you the next Judas Maccabeus? Which brings me to the second position I want to take, and it is the one I expect some viewers to push back on. The Maccabean revolt succeeded, and its success is the tragedy of this entire period. Follow the chain. Around 140 before Christ, the surviving Maccabee brother, Simon, was confirmed by popular assembly as leader and high priest of the Jewish people. 1 Maccabees 14:41 preserves the exact wording of the decree, and the wording is remarkable. Simon is to be leader and high priest forever, until a trustworthy prophet should arise. That last clause is a hinge. It is provisional. It is the assembly saying, we know this is irregular. We know a priestly family holding political power is not how this is supposed to work. So we are marking it temporary until someone with actual divine authority can tell us what to do. They set the bone with a splint and wrote on the splint that it comes off later. It never came off. It fused. The clause was quietly forgotten, and the Hasmonean family, descendants of Mattathias, became a dynasty. Priest kings. The two offices that the Hebrew scriptures had kept carefully separate welded together in one household. John Hyrcanus ruled from 134 to 104 before Christ and expanded the borders aggressively. He conquered Idumea, the old territory of Edom to the south, and according to Josephus he gave the population a choice: accept circumcision and the Jewish law, or leave. They accepted. Hold that thought for 1 minute. Hyrcanus was followed eventually by his son Alexander Jannaeus, who ruled from 103 to 76 before Christ, and who was, by any measure, a catastrophe. He was king and high priest simultaneously, which offended the devout. He fought constant wars. He used foreign mercenaries against his own people. And in 88 before Christ, after crushing a rebellion in which his religious opponents had allied with a foreign king against him, Josephus reports that Alexander Jannaeus had 800 of them crucified in the middle of Jerusalem, and had their wives and children killed in front of them while they hung there, while he watched from a banquet with his concubines. 800 crosses in Jerusalem, ordered by a Jewish high priest, roughly 120 years before another man was crucified outside the same city walls. The Maccabees began as the men who refused to bow to a tyrant. Within 80 years their family was the tyrant. After Jannaeus came his widow, and after his widow came his 2 sons. And the 2 sons went to war with each other over the succession. And in the middle of that civil war both sides did the same thing. They appealed to Rome for support. Rome accepted the invitation. In 63 before Christ, Pompey took Jerusalem after a 3-month siege. Josephus says he walked into the Holy of Holies, the room no one but the high priest could enter, and only once a year. He did not loot it, he simply looked. Judean independence, won by a hammer in a mountain pass, ended 100 years later because 2 brothers could not share a throne. And now pick up that thought from earlier. Because Rome's chief local ally through all of this was an Idumean administrator named Antipater, whose family had been converted at sword point by John Hyrcanus a couple of generations before. Antipater had a son. The son was named Herod. The forced conversion of Idumea by a Maccabean ruler produced the family that would take the throne of the Jews, rebuild the temple in its grandest form, and, according to Matthew's Gospel, order the killing of the children of Bethlehem. That is what I mean when I say the victory was the problem. Every step of that chain follows from the one before it. And the first step was a righteous man defending his faith in a village square. Meanwhile, underneath the politics, the parties were forming. Josephus describes them almost like schools of philosophy, which is itself a Greek way of describing them, and tells us that they were already recognizable around the middle of the 2nd century before Christ. The Pharisees. In Hebrew, parushim, from a root meaning to separate or to set apart. It may have started as an insult thrown at them by opponents, and been adopted as a badge, which is a pattern you see repeatedly in religious history. What they separated from is debated: ritual impurity, Hellenizing compromise, or the corruption of the Hasmonean court. Their central innovation was the oral law. Alongside the written text they held, there was a body of interpretation, handed down, applied, extended. And they held to the resurrection of the dead, to angels, to a coming judgment. The Sadducees, in Hebrew, Sedukim, most likely from Zadok, the priestly line of Solomon's temple. Aristocratic, priestly, tied to the temple and its revenues, and therefore tied to whoever held political power. They accepted the written law and rejected the accumulated interpretation, and they rejected the resurrection. Acts 23 verse 8 states it flatly. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection, and no angel or spirit. Mark 12 verse 18 introduces them the same way. Then there were the Essenes, who looked at the Hasmonean priesthood, decided the temple was irredeemably polluted, and withdrew to live in a community with its own calendar and its own rules, and who are the most likely candidates for the group that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here is the point. When the Sadducees come to Jesus in Mark 12 with the riddle about the woman who married 7 brothers, they are not asking a neutral theological question. They are running a 200-year-old party line at him, and everyone listening knows exactly which side he is being invited to join. He answers as a Pharisee would answer, and then he tells the Pharisees they have missed the point entirely. None of that lands if you skip the gap. Now the building that should not exist. Open a concordance and search the Hebrew Bible for the word synagogue. You will not find the institution. Not in the law, not in the prophets, not in Ezra or Nehemiah. There is no commandment to build one. There is no blueprint. There is nothing. Open the Gospels, and it is everywhere. Jesus teaches in synagogues as his standard practice. Luke 4 has him handed the Isaiah scroll in the synagogue at Nazareth. Paul's entire missionary method is to walk into the local synagogue first. So where did it come from? Honestly, we do not know, and anyone who tells you they do is overselling. The popular theory is that it began during the Babylonian exile as a substitute for the destroyed temple. It is plausible, we have no evidence for it. What we do have is this. The earliest hard evidence for a Jewish house of assembly is an inscription from Skydia, near Alexandria in Egypt, dedicating a building to King Ptolemy III and Queen Berenice, which places it between roughly 246 and 221 before Christ. The Greek word used is not synagogue, it is prosearch, prayer house. There is a similar inscription from elsewhere in Egypt, from the same century, which means the earliest evidence we possess for the most important religious institution of the Second Temple period comes not from Jerusalem, but from the diaspora, from Jews living far away from the temple who needed somewhere to gather, read, and pray. Here is the analogy I keep coming back to. The temple was a hearth, one fire, in one place, in one house. If you wanted warmth, you traveled to it. It was magnificent, and it was immovable. And its entire power was bound up in the fact that there was only one. The synagogue was a lantern, the same fire, divided, carried, set down wherever a family stopped, less impressive than a hearth, utterly unimpressive next to one. But you can carry a lantern onto a ship. In the year 70 after Christ, Roman legions burned the hearth to the ground and it has never been rebuilt. The lanterns were already in every port city in the empire. This is my third position, and it is the one I hold most strongly. The silence was not punishment, it was pedagogy. A people who could only be spoken to became a people who could read. A faith that could only be practiced in one building learned to be practiced in any building. A religion that depended on a live voice acquired a text, a class of interpreters, a portable liturgy, and a network of assemblies stretching from Persia to Rome. I am not going to pretend that is pure gain. Something real was lost. The immediacy of a prophet is not replaced by a well-run reading service, and the writers of the period knew it, which is why they kept writing that ache down. The stones stayed in the corner. Nobody could tell them what to do with the stones. But when the church exploded outward after Pentecost, it did not have to invent its infrastructure. It inherited it. Greek-speaking congregations gathered around a reed text in cities linked by Roman roads, expecting a Messiah. None of that existed when Malachi stopped writing. Which brings us to the most important thing manufactured in the gap. The word Messiah is old, but by the 1st century it had acquired a specification, and that specification was written in these years. Look at a document called the Psalms of Solomon, and specifically the 17th Psalm in that collection. It was composed by a devout Jewish group in the middle of the 1st century before Christ, in the wake of Pompey's arrival, and it is essentially a prayer of political rage and hope. It asks God to raise up their king, the son of David, at the time God chooses. It asks that he be given strength to shatter unrighteous rulers. It asks that he purge Jerusalem of the Gentiles who trample her. That is the first surviving use of the phrase Son of David as a title for the coming one. The community at Qumran expected something even more complicated. Their community rule anticipates the arrival of a prophet and 2 anointed figures, one from the priestly line of Aaron and one from the royal line of Israel. And behind all of it sat Daniel's prophecy of 70 weeks, which people were actively counting, and which is a large part of why the 1st century produced a series of men claiming to be the one and gathering armies. So here is the collision. By 4 before Christ, when a child is born in Bethlehem, the word Messiah has content. It means a Davidic king. It means military victory. It means the expulsion of Rome. It means the restoration of the throne and the purification of the temple. It means, in one word, another Judas Maccabeus. That is the definition Jesus walks into. That is what the crowd is shouting for on Palm Sunday when they wave palm branches, which had been a Maccabean victory symbol for 160 years. That is what Peter cannot accept in Matthew 16 when Jesus starts talking about suffering and dying. And it is what the 2 on the road to Emmaus mean when they say, with such heartbreak, we had hoped he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. They were not stupid, they were not faithless, they were working from the job description. And the job description had been written during the silence by people who had watched their temple defiled, and their nation occupied and their priesthood sold. Jesus does not fulfill that definition. He detonates it, and you cannot see him doing it unless you know what he was standing on top of. The vocabulary shifted too, and this part surprises people. Open the Gospels and you find developed teaching about angels and demons, about Satan as an organized adversary, about resurrection at the last day, about a place of fiery judgment called Gehenna. Now open the Hebrew Bible and look for that same furniture. It is thin. Angels appear but are mostly unnamed until Daniel. Satan appears as a role rather than a settled figure. Resurrection is present in Daniel 12 verse 2 and hinted at elsewhere, but it is not a developed doctrine. Gehenna is not a place of punishment at all. Gehenna is a literal ravine outside Jerusalem, the Valley of Hinnom, associated with child sacrifice under the worst of the kings. Between Malachi and Matthew, that vocabulary was worked out. In Enoch, in Jubilees, in the Qumran writings, in the wider literature of the period, Jewish writers developed accounts of angelic rebellion, of named archangels, of judgment, of the fate of the dead. Jude 14 and 15 quote Enoch directly, by name, as prophecy. I am not saying the Christian scriptures are derivative. I am saying they are fluent. Jesus and the apostles speak the language their hearers already spoke, and that language was assembled in the workshop of the silent years. By the time you reach the end of it, the stage is set with a thoroughness that is difficult to look at without feeling something. Herod, the Idumean whose family was converted at sword point by a Maccabee, was named king of the Jews by the Roman Senate in 40 before Christ, and took Jerusalem by force in 37. Around 20 before Christ he began rebuilding the temple on a scale that made it one of the wonders of the ancient world. Roman engineering had laid roads across the empire. Roman power had suppressed piracy in the Mediterranean. Greek was spoken in every port from Spain to Syria. Jewish communities with functioning assemblies existed in almost every major city. The Hebrew scriptures had been available in the international language for 2 centuries. Paul writes in Galatians 4 verse 4 that when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son. The Greek is pleroma to chrono, the filling up of the time, the moment when a vessel that has been slowly filling finally reaches the brim. I want to be careful here, because this argument can be made too neatly. It can slide into a tidy providential story, where every massacre and every crucified Pharisee is just a brick in a wall. I do not think you should say that about 800 men dying on crosses in Jerusalem. The suffering of those centuries was real suffering, and it was not made acceptable by what came afterward. But the shape is there. Whatever you make of it, the shape is there. And then it ends, and the way it ends is the most quietly perfect thing in this entire story. Luke 1. An elderly priest named Zechariah, of the division of Abijah, one of 24 rotating priestly courses, is chosen by lot to enter the sanctuary and burn incense. Understand what that means. There were thousands of priests. The lot fell to a man perhaps once in his lifetime, and many never got it at all. This was the single greatest morning of Zechariah's professional existence, and he was old and he knew there would not be another. He is standing in Herod's temple. In the building the Maccabees cleansed and the Idumeans rebuilt, alone in the smoke. And the angel Gabriel, whose name Jewish readers knew from the book of Daniel and from the literature of the 400 years, is standing at the right side of the altar of incense. The silence breaks. Right there, in that room, after 4.5 centuries, and Zechariah does not believe it. He asks for proof. He points out that he is old and his wife is old, and Gabriel tells him that because he did not believe, he will be unable to speak until the day these things happen. The silence ends, and the first thing that happens is that a man loses his voice. Zechariah walks out to a courtyard full of people who have been waiting and wondering why he took so long, and he cannot tell them. He gestures. He is mute for 9 months. He does not speak again until he writes his son's name on a tablet. His name is John. There is something almost unbearable in that. 400 years of a nation straining to hear something, and when heaven finally speaks, the one man in the room cannot repeat it. The word was going to come out anyway. It did not need him to carry it. So, to say it again, in the same words. God stopped speaking and started building. He built a class of men who could read and copy and teach a text. He built a language that would carry the message to every port in the empire. He built a portable assembly that could survive the destruction of the temple. He built a vocabulary of resurrection and judgment and angelic conflict, and he built a hunger so specific and so sharp that when the answer came in a form nobody had specified, the hunger was still the thing that recognized it. He built all of that in the years we labeled empty and skipped. Now widen it out as far as it will go. The church has now been waiting for its own returning Messiah for 2,000 years. That is 5 times longer than the gap between Malachi and Matthew. 5 times. And there are Christians in every generation of those 20 centuries who have concluded from the length of the wait that nothing is happening. The people of Modin would have told you nothing was happening. Ben Sira, writing his book in Jerusalem in 180 before Christ, would have told you nothing was happening. The men who put the defiled altar stones in the corner of the Temple Mount and walked away because there was no prophet to ask, they would have told you, with real grief, that nothing was happening. They were standing in the middle of the most consequential construction project in religious history, and they could not see it, because construction from the inside looks like noise, and rubble and unfinished walls. If God is who Christians claim he is, then he is not constrained by whether you can currently hear him. Silence from a person is usually absence. Silence from God, on the evidence of these 400 years, is more often preparation. The vessel fills quietly. You only notice it at the brim. If you want to test any of this for yourself, read 1 Maccabees. It sits in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, and in the Apocrypha section of many study Bibles, and it is free online in a dozen translations. It takes about an hour. Start at chapter 1 and read to chapter 4, and then go and read John 10 verse 22 again with the Feast of Dedication fresh in your mind. Then come back and tell me in the comments whether those years still sound silent to you.